Jane Urquhart's third novel, Away, was on the national bestseller list for 132 weeks, which is the longest of any Canadian book. Yes, okay. And also won the 1994 Trillium Award. Tonight, Jane will be reading from her most recent novel, Sanctuary Line.
Well, it's great to be here, and I have to say that in some wonderful way, the Trillium really was my first literary award, although one of my earlier books had won something called Le Prix de meilleur livre étranger in Paris, in France. Nobody knew what that was, actually, including me. But I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about that award because it seems to me to be kind of indicative of what awards can and often are about. When the first book that I was referring to that won the French prize was published, for months and months, I mean, you publish your first novel, you think, oh my God, at last I'm in print, and now in comes the praise. Well, not so much. Nothing came in for about 3 months, and then there was a very tiny review in a publication called Quill and Choir, and that review, one always remembers this, trust me, and I've been trying to get my editor to put this as a blurb on the back of my books ever since. It said, an ill-digested mishmash of grim Canadian themes and French linguistic theory. Now, what you have to know is that I was living with my husband and his 4 children from a previous marriage, and I had a baby. And all of us lived together full time. So I was kind of busy. I knew what the grim Canadian themes were, but I had no idea what the French linguistic theory was. Okay, so this book is published to not a lot of acclaim in Canada. As a matter of fact, not much attention whatsoever, except for negative attention. And then 2 or 3 years, no, I think about maybe not quite 2 years. 2 years later, it was picked up by a French publisher and published in France. And what to my, I mean, it's just too much, right? I mean, it won this thing called Le Prix de meilleur livre étranger, which people had, all kinds of people whom I admired and loved had won before me. It had been in existence since 1946, et cetera, et cetera. I was beside myself. No one in Canada paid any attention. They had no idea. As I say, none of us really knew what the award was. But I said to my publisher, this is wonderful, my French publisher. This is the best thing that's ever, it's the only thing that's ever happened to me, actually. It's not only the best, it's the only. Who was on the jury? And he said, you don't know? 12 of France's most distinguished literary theorists, thereby proving that the original negative review was correct. So there you go. And Wason, I too shared my Trillium Award with Margaret Atwood. So I have to ask you, where is Margaret Atwood tonight? She's embodied in both of us. I think if you put 2 of us together, you get 1 of her. Don't you think so? Anyway, I was lucky enough to win this wonderful award, and people did know who and what it was. And I was thrilled, of course. The book that won the award was a book called Away, and it had to do with Ireland. This was a book that I had written assuming that I was the only person in Canada of Irish descent. Well, apparently not. And I suspect that may have had a little bit to do with it being on the bestseller list as long as it was, because the Irish have a tendency to go forth and multiply as instructed by the Bible. And they do that whether they're in Ireland or whether they're part of the diaspora. Anyway, so what I thought I would read tonight is from my most recent novel, because I've been sort of milking the Irish thing ever since, in hopes that some other book might stay on the bestseller list for 100 and however many weeks it was on. So far, no luck, by the way, but you can change all that. I'm going to read from a book called Sanctuary Line. I should say that this book is about Ontario, and it's about many different kinds of immigrants to Ontario, because Ontario is a place of immigrants, with the exception of our First Nations people. We all come from somewhere else. It's just a matter of how long ago we came. And so I'm dealing with the Irish immigration and also Kurdish immigration. There are a number of sort of immigrants in this book. But I'm also dealing with something that I think that we don't pay enough attention to, and that's migrant labor. There are a lot of people who come to this province to work in the fields in the summer, doing jobs for us that many of us are unwilling to do. And they have their own story and their own experience of Ontario. And it felt important to me to in some way honor that experience. Now, having said that, what I'm going to read tonight will only have one reference to a person from a migrant background, and his name is Teo. So when you hear the word Teo, you'll know who it is. Most of this has to do with stories told by a charismatic uncle to his Irish family of some generations, a family that is now fully Canadian. Anyway, no more. The first in the litany of lighthouses, or at least the first according to my not always accurate uncle, was situated on one of the two Skellig Islands that rise like temples from the sea off the most western tip of the south of Ireland. Everything about this lighthouse was improbable and exaggerated. Its elevated position, the constant rain, the near impossibility of its construction, or even of landing boats filled with materials on the island, the tortuous climb up the cliffs carrying cut stone, wrought iron, and glass. And then there was the monstrous wind that would pluck workers as if they were insects from the rising tower and throw them either onto the rocks below or into the sea, from which their bodies were never recovered. But there had been a precedent for this astounding feat of engineering. Engineering is the theme tonight, too. During the 6th century, on the highest peak of the landward side of the island, a small group of self-punishing monks had set up a colony. Surely, my uncle had said, the first generation of these holy men would have been entirely worn out and used up in the task of carving the steps for the 3 separate staircases, one of 600 steps out of the steep rock face that led to their monastic enclosure, a gathering of a half a dozen corbelled, beehive-shaped huts, a small medieval priory, an oratory, 2 wells, and some stone basins dug out of the same rock face to collect rainwater. There was also, of course, a graveyard consisting of a half a dozen rough stone crosses. My uncle took great pleasure at the thought of his forebear, Tim Butler, the one he named the dog after, making tea from the water he collected from the monks' stone basins. No mention at all was made, however, of his wife, who was undoubtedly washing clothes, bathing babies, cooking or cleaning with the water he called the heavenly gift. Every second year, a mainland keeper would offer to take up the post so that Keeper Butler and his family could get back to Butler's Court for Christmas. And each time the second year came around, the weather would cancel that possibility with winds of increasing velocity. And Keeper Butler would have wanted to get back, I would think, hoping to stake out at least a bit of symbolic territory in that quite possibly fictional place, because as my uncle said, only one son could inherit the land, and Keeper Butler was not that son. He was the bifurcating one. Even as a child, I remember thinking I had been genetically affected by the serial division among my ancestors. The entirety of my early life was bisected by seasons. In the autumn, winter, and spring, my mother and I lived in the city in the modest square brick house that my father had bought and thankfully paid for before he died. But my true sense of home and belonging was activated only in the summer when my mother and I settled into this farmhouse. I wonder now whether Butler the Light, a name given to Keeper Butler by the fishermen of Kerry, would have been visited by this same sense of belonging had he been able to, quotes, get off the rock and return even briefly to the green fields of Butler's Court. Or was he fully owned by the sea and the wind and perhaps also the phantom monks? What eventually liberated him from this ownership, if indeed it existed, was a string of escalating tragedies of such dimensions that no man or woman could possibly retain a sense of duty, never mind a fondness for the environment that was responsible for causing them. First, the light that Keeper Butler had so faithfully kept burning was smashed by a 200-foot rogue wave just at the moment when he had finished climbing the tower's 100 steps to inspect it. A hailstorm of glass shards descended on him and entered his flesh wherever it could, as well as his hair, his tongue, and gums, and one bright eye from which he was never able to see again. A new light was duly and without doubt riskily delivered and installed, and Butler the Eye, as the mainlanders now called him, returned to his duties. He had 2 sons, children so frequently storm-stayed inside the keeper's cottage that they would cry to be outdoors the minute the wind abated, even marginally, or when a stray shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds. 6 and 8 years old, they played most often in the one small, startlingly green meadow called Christ's Saddle, which the monks 1,000 years before had probably made by hand with layers and layers of seaweed in order to support a cow, a donkey, and a goat, and which, surrounded by sloping rock, provided as much outdoor shelter as could be hoped for on the island. How did they play? What kind of island games were invented by them? These were the kinds of questions my uncle would ask us when we were bored or whining for some new toy or for the television. Come on, he would say, those kids out on the Skelligs had absolutely no toys, and weather was their only television. The weather, indeed. What kind of unusual games did absorb them, I wonder, before they heard the extreme howl of the fatal wind that tossed them both out of that man-made meadow and into the waves below, like coins into a fountain, my uncle said, relishing the metaphor. But they were not tossed so far that their bodies were unrecoverable, and poor Butler the Eye found his sons bumping up against the shore the following day as he made a frantic tour of the island. First one, the 8-year-old, my uncle said, making the story more precise than it needed to be, and then the other. Only 100 yards apart, they seemed unharmed, their bodies free of mutilation, their eyes staring. Both children were buried in the monks' graveyard, and the ground of which had not been opened for centuries. And after the burial, Keeper Butler wrote a letter to the Commissioners of Irish Lights, requesting a transfer to the mainland. This transfer was accomplished, and Butler the Eye lived long enough to father 2 more sons, who, like their father, became lighthouse keepers. But for me, the story, thrilling as it was, really began with the burial of those island boys in the monks' graveyard. As a child, I developed a theory, though this was never suggested by my uncle, that those children would have become ghosts almost immediately in such surroundings, and that they would have been instructed in the rights and obligations of the spirit world by their neighbors, the shades of the monks. I imagined, or tried to imagine, what shape their conversations might take, and whether as ghosts the whole company might be affected by the wind. Sometimes I still dream of flapping sackcloth and shards of glass. Once during that last summer, I told Teo the story of Keeper Butler. He listened intently, then said that although he couldn't remember hearing it, he somehow already knew the story of the 2 drowned boys and the community of monks who had settled there so long ago. At the time, I wondered if there might have been a Mexican lighthouse with a similar story attached to it. But now I realize that my uncle's stories took paths we would never know about and were repeated in rooms we would never see, heard like a dream whispered uncertainly on the edge of sleep, used perhaps to buy time or affection. Is there anyone alive who remembers these tales, I now wonder? Shane and Dawn and I have never spoken of them. Is this recounting to be their eventual destination? Perhaps you will tell them to someone sometime, and they, in turn, will tell someone else. Thank you very much.